Good morning. My name is Denny Brennan. I'm the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Health Data Consortium, and I want to welcome you to today's Executive Forum, the 11th of our monthly forums for 2023, dedicated to the road to interoperability and the many facets that one must address and the steps that one must make in that journey. Just a couple of rules of order and reminders. This forum will run with our guests from 9 until 10 Eastern Time, 1 hour, after which we will have an optional 30-minute discussion with folks from MHDC and those among our guests who are able to stay. So we'd ask them that they make that choice on their own. That's optional for our guests. Please use the Q&A, speak up, raise your hand. This is a forum. This is meant to be as much of an engaged discussion as it is a presentation. So as John Halamka remembers very well, our CIO forum, which he chaired for many years, was built on that kind of engagement. And it's one we try to duplicate as we move into this virtual environment. So we encourage you to ask your questions, raise your hand, participate. The recording of today's forum will be available at our website, mahealthdata.org, in about a day or so. If you would like to see a copy of the presentation or review the video, that will be both of those will be available for you. Lastly, at the end of today's discussion, we will have a brief survey, a 30-second survey we ask you to complete upon leaving the Zoom meeting. So other things for us to take into consideration are, of course, our two co-chairs, David Caruso, the Chief Technology Officer at Point32 Health, and Bill Young, the Chief Information Officer at Berkshire Health Systems. Gentlemen, would you like to say a few words before we get ourselves started today?
Well, Denny, thank you. I just wanted to welcome everybody. I think we have a fantastic panel today. As you were mentioning, John, co-chairing the CIO forum way back in the day, it brought back a lot of great memories, a lot of good discussions, knee deep in the policy making. And I know, we've got executive orders on AI, and this is going to be an interesting topic. Absolutely. Top of mind for everybody these days. So welcome, and I can't wait for the discussion.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Bill Young, the CIO at Berkshire Health Systems. John, we all know John. John is a rock star in our industry, and it's awesome to have someone who thinks about things on a global level. On the introduction, we were talking about 4 billion people. It's just amazing for someone like me who thinks about a little section of our country. And Stephen, thank you for joining us this morning from the ONC and the work you do on our other rock star who closes out the year, Mickey Tripathi. So again, we're closing out the year in such an awesome way. Denny, this has been a great forum series, and today the topic of AI on every leader, every IT leader, and every trustee and board member. So wow, hang on for the ride.
Thank you, gentlemen. So it's my great pleasure, as I mentioned, to introduce Stefan Konya, who is the Senior Advisor and Innovation Portfolio Lead for the Office of the National Coordinator, and Dr. John Halamka, who is the President of the Mayo Clinic Platform. Today, we're going to be talking about the uses of AI, and having done this a number of times before with Dr. Halamka and Stefan, I know you are comfortable with this kind of interplay and this back and forth. We're going to turn the discussion over to you and welcome you to introduce yourselves, and then we'll get our conversation started. Stefan, we'll start with you.
Sounds great, and thank you, Denny. So thank you very much to everyone who decided to take time out of their day today and to listen in on this call. I've been following the series this entire year, and I've really enjoyed the topics that have been discussed. And as was mentioned before, we're going to close out the year with my boss, Dr. Mickey Tripathi, and Alex Muggy from CMS. So definitely stay tuned for that one. Mickey's great to listen to. My role is kind of a unique one at ONC. It's a little interesting in the sense that it changes from day to day as far as what types of projects and topics I get to work on. And that's partially because my general duties are focused on supporting the innovation community, those who are trying to disrupt and challenge the status quo, bring new tools and ideas to market, and then figuring out what are the things that are slowing the pace of that adoption of those types of innovative and novel approaches. Something that I get to work on with a team across ONC is looking at the horizon and where there are emerging uses of technology, new approaches that maybe the federal government doesn't quite have their hands fully around it. There might be some gaps in governance and gaps in oversight, gaps in having the appropriate rails in place. And AI is certainly one of those areas where a number of years ago, although we had dabbled in looking at the use of AI in health IT, we hadn't really felt like we got our full hands around it and knew that we need to do a little bit more work. John, you might recall in just about 2 years ago or so, we had a responsible use of AI in health IT showcase that we hosted. And it had about 30-something presentations, all quick, short presentations. Half of them were from industry and half of them were from all the different federal agencies, just to try to bring everybody up to speed on who was doing what, where, when it came to the responsible use of AI in healthcare. And I think it was pretty eye-opening for a lot of people as far as what was happening, the fact that there was efforts underway, but it was also very clear that we needed a more coordinated approach. And that's something that ONC has been proud to be working with all of our federal partners on, including the FDA, NIH, HRQ, and the list goes on and on. So we're excited today to have this conversation and see we've done a lot in those last several years, including most recently ONC put out a kind of a stake in the ground through our health technology interoperability, or HTI-1 proposed rule, where we try to enhance our work in the past through a certification program, where we have had a partnership role with the FDA to look on the criteria for clinical decision support tools, or CDSTs, and try to expand that a little bit and look at how we can increase transparency and accountability around predictive decision support interventions. So a little bit of a broader bucket. And that although that comment period has closed, we're still working with people to get feedback on their thoughts on it to make sure we roll it out in the right way. And John and the CHI group and the Health AI Partnership and now Valid AI and all these other organizations that are going on have really been valuable forums for us to collect that type of information. So with that, I will pause and hand it over to my colleague, John, to kind of introduce himself, but excited for the conversation today.
Well, what a great introduction, and thanks for teeing that up. And so ask yourself, did you wake up this morning saying if you only had an algorithm, life would be better? Chances are you didn't. If you talk to CEOs in healthcare around the world, they tell you really three things. And this is not just the US. I just flew in from Norway a few hours ago. They say that financially, supporting the elderly population, as society has lower birth rates, lower graduates of medical school, longer lifespans, but not always longer quality of lifespans, that's a business problem. That's a healthcare problem. It's a societal problem. How are you going to solve it? Clinicians are burned out. I mean, COVID was hard. Not doctors, nurses, social workers, mental health professionals. They aren't always practicing at the top of their license. They have a lot of administrative burden, and maybe you need to more effectively triage to the right specialist, the right patient at the right time. And we're having workforce, just general issues of making sure everything that goes into the delivery of healthcare, and the people who are helping us with supplies, the people who are doing every healthcare duty, are hard to find and hard to retain. So if there's a series of business problems, the question we have to ask is, how can the use of technology resolve some of those, prepare us for the future? I think back on our 30 plus years together, Denny, and if you were to ask, how long does it take an organization to go from there is an idea, there is an innovation, to implementation? The answer is about 18 months because of lawyering. I know that's not a verb. Compliance, privacy, security, planning, and getting all stakeholders aligned. My role at Mayo Clinic is to turn 18 months into 18 minutes. How can you globally prepare for this future? And ask, how do you bring nation scale data together in an ethical, privacy protecting fashion to create the new products and solutions and disseminate those product solutions from country to country, and do that in a very rapid fashion that is peer-to-peer, that is not only technology, but it's policy. Stefan, it's the work we've done together, and that it's cultural change. And so as we talk today, because we'll drill down on AI use and regulation and such, but always to the eye of what are we going to do to make sure the patient has the best experience wherever they are in the world, and the technology that all of us can work on to make that happen. So Denny and Bill and Dave, turn it back to you.
Well, let's start with a question, and certainly these are opportunities, these questions, to extemporize and to bring up a lot of different things. But we thought, as we've done in other forums, that having these questions as a substructure, or at least a sort of a push to the conversation, would be a great way for us to do this. The first question we have is, what different types of AI do you use, or are in use today? What are some of the ways they are used? And how does one decide when and how to use a particular type of AI technology? Steph, and I'll start with you, and then John, I'll go with you.
Well, it's an interesting question to ask a government agency, because we can look at this in a couple different ways, right? So one is at HHS, we have an office of the Chief AI Officer, Greg Singleton, and his team. And they're really evaluating and looking across all of HHS as far as the actual ways that the government agencies are using AI themselves. In some cases, for instance, at Indian Health Service, or even outside of HHS at the VA or DoD, Defense Health Administration, they're actually using it in healthcare settings for healthcare reasons, right? Whether that be on the administrative side or clinical uses of it. But aside from that, almost all the rest of the government agencies under HHS are using it for things like grants management, timekeeping, or other purposes that don't really have a healthcare context to it necessarily. So as far as how we're using AI, much like everybody else in the world, we're using it in a lot of different ways. I think for the purpose of today's conversation, what might be better for me to do is talk about the ways that we are looking and evaluating the responsible use of AI in the marketplace by folks like John Halamka in the Mayo Clinic and what they're doing with the platform, and by a number of other organizations out there. So the thing that we're considering here is that we know that years ago, 5-10 years ago, the average healthcare system was probably using somewhere around 18 to 20 or so algorithms that they could really identify as being an algorithm that they were deploying. So it was a pretty minimal deployment in the average healthcare system. Obviously, there's some that are further ahead. Mayo Clinic's probably an example of one of those early adopters that was further ahead. But nowadays, the average system is 180 to 250 algorithms that they're deploying. And often with minimal enterprise level governance structures in place. They're evaluating them as one-off solutions. And we're concerned that they don't have the right level of transparency and accountability into looking and making intelligent decisions about how to deploy those solutions. The black box challenge, not understanding really what kind of data it's been trained on, what types of settings it's been tested in, things that are pretty basic like that you would hope to have that type of information so you can compare and understand the risks associated with deploying that algorithm, especially in a patient setting, right, in a clinical setting. So we know that the FDA for years has been looking at the clinical efficacy of algorithms that are claiming to have some kind of a clinical benefit to it. And certainly, have had a pretty good handle on that, but there's a lot of other algorithms that fall outside of that realm and are in this gray area where we don't think we've had good enough oversight. With the executive order that was just signed on the October 30th, it challenges all of government and not just HHS to really look at how can we support a more fair and transparent environment for the use of AI in society. And it does call out specifically HHS to try to build some infrastructure in place to help the healthcare industry do a better job of evaluating such tools and things like that. So again, we've been working across government with many agencies behind the scenes to try to figure out what is that web of governance and oversight that the government can help support, not necessarily stifle innovation. We always got to remember we need to be able to compete on a global scale and be leading the way when it comes to innovation. But how do we, set that floor, that basic minimal level of governance and oversight to make sure that these tools can be trusted? Because ultimately, that's going to slow the adoption of these tools, right? If there's no trust in them, then we've seen it. There's a slower pace of adoption. So we're doing what we can and trying to figure out how, working collectively across federal government, we can provide a better fabric for that trust and accountability. And again, that's kind of how we're looking at it. There's a lot of different task force and efforts underway within the government, agency to agency. And so again, there's a lot coming out in guidance, but also hopefully tightening up some of our areas of regulation where appropriate, and of course where it doesn't stifle innovation, but helps kind of encourage further adoption. So I don't know if that exactly addresses your question, but we're a little unique being the government, so I'll hand
Well,
it.
this is
on.
a thought starter too. We're not trying to buttonhole you into a particular answer. We look at these as being questions that can get a conversation started, but that was very helpful. John, I turn it to you.
Well, that's great. Thanks so much. So think about the life cycle for a moment of machine learning. And there are about 10 steps, but it starts with such things as, what do you want to do? What's the use case? And then that will inform what's the data that's needed. And then you may need to curate, normalize that data. You then may need to annotate. You may need to say, oh, this is a tumor, this is a cancer. Then you go to model creation. Once you've created a model, you then need to go to validation, run the model against some data different from your training set. Then you actually might go to multi-site validation, because you might want to take this outside of your locality or your country. Then once you've done that, you probably have some regulatory oversight, whether that's software as a medical device, CE, or other regulations that apply. Then you deploy. And then once you deploy, you then have to understand, are clinicians using it? What's the user acceptance? And then you ask the question, did it make an impact? What are the outcomes on patient care? And then you monitor, because we know that algorithms that may be good today, a year from now, may not be so good. And then the cycle continues. I tell you that as a preamble because what Mayo did is it recognized, to solve some of the business issues around the world that I described, we recognized we need to organize the world's data. And here's a challenge. I mean, we have HIPAA, there's GDPR in Europe, there's various privacy laws in China, Brazil, Canada, data residency in Israel. Every country will have a different view of how you're going to organize data if you're going to create these kinds of models that are going to help transform our care delivery. So in the United States, what we said is de-identification, creating a very large anonymized data set, seems to be a pretty good idea. The challenge with that, as we all know, because we've all worked on this for decades, structured data is not so hard. You just remove the 18 HIPAA identifiers on problems, meds, allergies, labs. You're in a pretty good place, as long as you put it in a secure container and prohibit such things as linkage, as LaTanya Sweeney did some years ago to re-identify DID data. Harder was the unstructured text, because it may say, and Denny, of course, I make this up, this CEO of the Mass Health Data Consortium, right? It didn't have a name, didn't have an address, but I would argue the bin size of CEOs of Mass Health Data Consortium would be under 10. So one has to go through all the unstructured data, remove the job roles, geographies, and familial relationships, and change them to something else. So in the case of Denny, I could just say this IT technology and policy leader, something that makes that pretty hard to re-identify. So we did that on 10 million patients, and we did it on structured, unstructured. We did it on images, telemetry, digital pathology, and genomics. And then created, Denny, about 180 models in the fields of cardiology, neurology, behavioral health, issues of radiation oncology, delivery of auto-contouring profiles, advanced care in the home, cancer care in the home. And then, of course, had to take those through, some of them anyway, through FDA processes to get appropriate oversight and approval. And so then put those into production and ensure they are doing no harm. So we've had to do that in the context of the electronic health record, or the PAC system, or the digital pathology PACs. And then, of course, do we do randomized clinical trials on those to look to see if they've really had an impact? And what you see is a number of these algorithms can make clinicians 20 or 30% better, and that they're more early diagnosis of disease, or they are getting advice from a super subspecialist, even though they may be in primary care. And so in the predictive AI realm, that is deployed today. And it's doing things like saying, oh, the patient in front of you right now may have an ejection fraction less than 50, you might consider an echo, or they may have a future chance of atrial fibrillation, or the patient in front of you may be showing signs of early dementia. These kinds of augmented care delivery processes that make our clinicians safer and higher quality. But there's another use case, and that would be in the generative AI space. And I would argue generative AI very different, because I can tell you that, as we'll talk about in a few minutes, the accuracy of a predictive AI algorithm against ground truth. Measuring accuracy against generative AI output, pretty hard. And even if you could, the prompt you give today may result in a different answer tomorrow. So our use cases for generative AI are more things like helping clinicians draft email responses to patients, helping clinicians in creating documentation which is reviewed and edited before saving, helping with some of the administrative issues, filling out forms, things of that nature. But it will evolve. And so we have a series of projects going on. Some of them, to my colleagues at MHDC, you may sound a little speculative, but like creating a unique foundation model from scratch using the data of Mayo Clinic and partners instead of the public internet. Will it hallucinate less? Will it have a better medical vocabulary? Will it be more empathetic? To be determined. Last thing I'll say is, yes, we've done this for Mayo, but we've also done this for Canada, Brazil, Korea, Singapore, and in these last 10 days, Denmark, Netherlands, Belgium, Norway, Sweden have all agreed to join this global, federated, decentralized approach to do machine learning creation and validation. So, still some countries to go, and I will serve in this presidential role at Mayo for about 4 more years, because I have a term limit, as all good presidents should. Turn it back to you.
You talk about generative AI, and our colleague Dave Delano asks, with all the discussion, some hype, where are we on that classic Gartner hype curve when it comes to generative AI? John, I'll start with you, and then Stefan, I'll go to you.
Oh, sure. Well, I think we've already seen it past the peak of inflated expectations. Certainly November 2022, everyone sees ChatGPT. Everyone says, oh my God, I need to rename my company, instead of the iced tea company, the generative AI iced tea company. It was blockchain all over again. And I think people have recognized that the hallucination or fabrication, whatever you want to call it, is such that you really can't, at the moment, use generative AI for differential diagnosis or try to use it for inference beyond the training set it was given. And so people are starting to say, oh, I see. We have to retune. We have to optimize. We have to potentially build new tools to have oversight of these things that we don't have today. So we have to proceed in more limited use cases. So we're heading toward that trough of disillusionment right now.
Stefan, what about you? What are your thoughts on that?
I agree with John, and it's funny actually. I think we reached that peak of enlightenment extremely fast. It was like I think faster than a lot of other areas, maybe even faster than it was for blockchain. But it's something to consider here is also the other uses that we are seeing today in generative AI, which are a little bit more palatable, I think, for healthcare systems, which are more like on the administrative side, using them for digging through notes and pulling insights out for communications and between patients, and being able to discern a ton of data as it's coming through. And we're seeing that not only being deployed by healthcare systems, but also by third-party vendors and other external solutions that are bringing it to the healthcare systems as specific tools for specific purposes on the administrative side. So I think there is a lot of opportunity potential there. Sometimes it's the less sexy areas of healthcare, in the administrative weeds, where this technology can be most beneficial, at least early on. And that's not too different than it was with blockchain, right? The early adoption of blockchain and use cases that are being deployed in healthcare were for like contract management and, supply chain logistics and management, right? And so there's a number of other areas where it's being deployed, rather than what the hype was all about, which was blockchains is going to replace all electronic health record vendors, right? And we knew that there was definitely some, overblown hype there, just the whole idea of rip and replace and so on, and unvetted technology in that sense. But the idea of a distributed ledger could be used in a lot of things. And I think it's the same way with generative AI. It can be applied all over the place. It already is being used in some areas. And people are still very much, toying with it and figuring out, but it gets better and better every day, right? If we look at where it was from, the first time ChatGPT came out to where it is today, it's vastly improved. So it's exciting for the future of it. But again, we also need to be looking at what kind of guardrails do we need to be in place? Does there need to be disclaimers when something has been used and people are aware that there is some kind of a algorithmic, NLP, ChatGPT function that's being used behind the scenes, and that they're actually interacting and talking with something that has come from that sort of technology, rather than this is produced by a doctor or whatever it may be, right? So just again, getting back to transparency and accountability, making sure we have those mechanisms in place, just to be honest about how these technologies are being used, and make sure that patients and their families and doctors are aware of the information they're getting, of the source and where it's coming from.
And that's very well
Terrific.
said.
Thank
I'll add
you.
one more example to that real quick,
Sure, John.
which is generative AI is actually fairly good at summarization. You give it a prompt, you say, write this for a sixth grader, write this in 500 words, not 1,000 words. I'll put a link in the chat for a paper that came out last week in the Mayo Clinic Proceedings, which asks, can you use large language models to edit your academic papers? And in this case, I'm the senior author of the paper, but GPT-4 is the editor of the paper. A little ironic that GPT-4 is editing a paper about generative AI, but you'll read the paper. I'll send it to you.
Thank you. Stefan.
Yeah, I just wanted to add one other thing that I forgot to mention is, and this might pivot our conversation. I'm not sure if you want to go down this dark tunnel, but when we think about the risk for bias and health inequities being exacerbated through the use of algorithms, I think this is one area when it comes to generative AI that we need to be especially cognizant of, right? So a lot of what generative AI is doing is collecting information that's already kind of out there and in society, and then assessing that, summarizing that, and putting that forward. And the problem is that can lead to exacerbating societal bias and societal inequities that are out there. So we have to make sure we have the evaluation tools in place to look at that. This isn't just mirroring essentially what some of the biases are that exist in today's society, and further exacerbating that. If you think about, I'm trying to remember which tool it was, if it was Facebook or who it was when they released that AI bot years ago. And they released it onto like social media. It took a matter of like a day before it turned extremely racist, cruel, violent. It was like, and they had to quickly shut it down. I don't know, John, if you remember who exactly that was, but it's like an example of like, oh, this is great. But it was just mirroring what it was hearing on social media, right? It's just feeding off of that. And it's changed its personality in this AI bot to becoming very dark very quickly. So we have to make sure that, before we release these types of things or use them in healthcare settings with patients and families, that they are, not just going to mirror some of the inequities and biases that exist in society still today.
Right. And to give you
Janice.
a quick modern example.
Sorry, John, go ahead.
Yeah, real quick modern example. Peter Lee at Microsoft, and this has been fixed, but it was just probably 2 months ago, went into a generative AI product and said, hey, product, complete this sentence. Women can't. And of course, it came back with answers like, be president. And it's because, as you point out, it's trained on all the dreck in the public internet.
Janice, you have a question?
No, I just want to make a really quick comment. You should be careful with the summarization. And as they say, things are constantly getting better. So hopefully this won't happen much in the future. But when we did some experimentation, one of the things that we did was ask for articles to be summarized. And we got back results that didn't match, that were almost like they were press releases for the companies when the article was pointing out something the company did wrong. So you do need to be careful about outside information getting into and leaking into things that you ask to be summarized when you're using things like ChatGPT.
Thank you. Why don't we move on to our next question? Healthcare organizations are now undertaking, and John, with CHI, this is certainly a central tenet to that organization's founding, but organizations are looking at how to use these technologies. And at the same time, in the LaTanya Sweeney example you shared, they're trying to maintain privacy. They're trying to respect, to the degree they can, the intellectual property of individuals who may end up being, part of the AI, part of the learning of the algorithm, respecting consent and minimizing bias. What do you see as the roadmap for healthcare organizations to undertake this journey? And John, I'll start with you, and then Stefan, I'll go to you.
Sure. So every algorithm we create will be biased. It will be biased in some fashion. And that will sometimes be a reflection of the training set. And we, as a country, and you see this in the executive order, for every product need to have an AI assurance lab independently produce a data card and a model card. What data was used to train it? How does this perform stratified by race, ethnicity, gender, age, geography, etc.? So you then understand what the biases are, and then you mitigate the bias. So I give you it's a real example, but we have one cardiology algorithm that works exceedingly well if your body mass index is below 31, and really poorly if the body mass index is above 35. So it's ethical to use it on patients with a body mass index under 31 and certainly not above 35. So understand the bias, mitigate the bias. The dream goes something like this. Every product goes through validation. The validation is then put into a nationwide registry. And I'm hopeful that ONC, FDA, and other colleagues will help us with standards around what do we measure and how do we publish them. And then the electronic health record will be able to say, oh, for the patient in front of you right now, I'm going to go out to that registry. I'm going to pull down the model that's going to likely work for the person in front of you now based on all social determinants of health, and then give an answer that is likely to be useful. And that's the kind of pattern for the use of these things that we have to put in place.
Stefan, your thoughts?
I had to unmute there. So, I agree with everything John said once again. He's really been leading the way on this, especially as part of CHI and some of these other groups who are thinking about, how can they put forth some guidance and best practices and test these types of things, not just within Mayo Clinic, but, as a healthcare ecosystem. And we've been, excited to be able to participate in those meetings and help kind of make sure that the policies that we're developing both reflect what we think is possible and needs to be happening, but also what we think the industry is prepared to adopt and use. So one thing to think about is, just looking at what we proposed in the Health Technology Interoperability Rule, or the HTI-1 rule. And again, the comment period is closed, and we'll be, be coming back on what the final result of all this is, hopefully getting to a final rule on it. But there's kind of three key areas that we hope healthcare systems are thinking about this, right? One is risk analysis, and John touched on this a little bit earlier. The second is risk mitigation. So when they identify that risk, they're doing what they can to try to, minimize and root out that risk. And then the third thing is really thinking through the governance on the back end, and that gets to what John was talking about as well, as far as the ongoing maintenance post-deployment, in monitoring of these solutions and their effectiveness. And whatever the government does as a result of its EO on putting in, an assurance lab or some kind of mechanism to help kind of validate these tools, we got to think through also, how do we do it on an ongoing basis, right? It's just not enough to try to figure out how can we evaluate them initially, but how do we do it over time, to look for things like data drift or model drift, where the inputs change over time and ultimately can change the result and outcome of those tools. So we think that we've got a pretty well-designed plan for where we have regulatory authority, as we manage a certification program for certified health IT vendors. And we've got 8 principles that basically we've been able to focus on: validity, reliability, robustness, fairness, intelligibility, safety, security, and privacy. So we really do try to lay out kind of a roadmap for things that need to be able to have certified health IT developers attesting to and evaluating and looking at the source attributes that'll hopefully make it easier again for healthcare systems to do the right risk analysis, to do the right risk mitigation, and to maintain the right governance and effective management of these tools into the future. And also, we put forth the FAVES concept in this regulation, FAVES. Government loves our acronyms, and this is probably one of my favorite ones. No pun intended, or maybe it is. But to make sure that these tools are fair, appropriate, valid, effective, and safe. We think that is a good concept. We hope that when it comes to decision support interventions, that this will again, give some consistency to the way that healthcare stakeholders, like providers and healthcare institutions, delivery networks, can look at these tools, and understand the role that they have to monitor these things in those phase categories. To make sure that they're rolling them out. And we think that most, or if not all of them, are already thinking that way. But as far as, deploying it into a consistent, way for governance and long-term management of these tools, and early evaluation and looking at the risk associated with them, we want to make it as simple and as consistent as possible. And that also makes it easier for us to regulate it from that standpoint as well, working with our partners at FDA and other agencies. So again, we think we laid out a really good, strong plan. We're excited about it. And we did get a mix of comments back as, everything from this is going to be amazing to you're going to, this is going to blow up the world. How dare you, dabble into this? But there was a lot of good, solid feedback that came in between those two lines. And hopefully what you see on the end product will be something that all of us, can be proud of.
Thank you. There's a question from a member of our audience who asks, it seems that private companies cannot get away from training their algorithms on public data, whether they buy that data from third parties or go to sources that are outside their organization. Are there any ideas, John, you alluded to this initially, on how an organization can contractually require and determine if an algorithm being utilized has been built up with only the organization's data or with an appropriately clean, relatively speaking, set of training data? John, I'll start with you.
Sure. Why don't I give you a real example? So Mayo operates an AI assurance lab, and a commercial entity can come to that AI assurance lab, and we will test their algorithm against 10 million patients. And we will give them a 20-page report with 200 subgroup analyses, and they'll say, oh my God, I developed this algorithm on 1,000 patients. I had no idea it was so awful. And then what we say is, well, let's understand what you're going to use this for, where you're going to use it. And now let's bring you into a de-identified secure environment for redevelopment, retraining of the algorithm. And so this is why Mayo has created this federation of participants around the world so that companies can come into that environment and create much more locally tuned algorithms that are likely to be more useful. And the real example I'll give you is we found one commercial algorithm that came to us that had an area under the curve of 0.95 for self-declared Caucasians and an area under the curve of about 0.33 for self-declared Hispanics. And it's because their training data set was so limited. And so now these things get corrected by using the data of a variety of Latin American countries and then redeployed.
Yeah, and
Stefan, there's a go ahead.
I was just going to add to that. So this has always been a challenge, and that's not unique to AI. As far as any kind of tool that's been developed in healthcare, is the challenge is getting access to good quality data, to build it, to validate it, and then ultimately to try to sell it, to different customers and healthcare providers and so on, with enough evidence that they feel that they can trust it and so on. But the gold standard is always going to be then, how can you create a test environment within that specific institution to run it again and see how does it perform at the same rate of success with that specific patient population, right, in that geographic location, with those demographics of that patient population. Because right now the bulk of the data that's been out there for algorithms to be trained on and other solutions to be tested on is either large sets of data that's not really representative of the full population. It's usually more affluent Caucasian populations, with not a great amount of diversity into it. We see that in imaging issues in the past where algorithms are being trained on largely Caucasian patients and then perform at a significantly lower success rate when being tested against those patients of color. So there's a number of examples out there of that, but the gold standard is always going to be like how can you create a safe test environment? And obviously some health systems like Mayo are equipped to do that, where they've built that internal processes, and because they've got the resources to do it or they prioritize it. But we know that there's a large number of other institutions that don't have those resources, especially small and medium provider settings that essentially don't even have an IT office sometimes. And how are they supposed to build that? They have to kind of take those solutions and tools at face, read the literature, and it's difficult for them to test it in their own specific environment before they go to deploy it. And obviously there's synthetic data that's out there, and the synthetic data sets are getting better and better, more representative and so on. But there's still the gold standard is that real world data. And being able to get to use that. Now, there are a lot of projects underway too. I'm sure John's familiar with this and can probably speak a little bit more to it, but there's Project DataSphere and a couple of other areas in the field of oncology and cancer. ARPA-H and their data fabric toolbox is trying to build a resource for making more data available for cancer research. So there are certainly a lot of areas of that, but once you get into data that you want that's extremely valuable, that's where it becomes a little bit more difficult to get a hold of, and whether that's because of marketplace dynamics where people see the value in that data and they want to be able to monetize the value of that data, or whether it's just because of an extensive valid IRB process because of the privacy and security of that data and not wanting to disclose any PII and whatever else it may be. So there's a lot of challenges there. Respecting consent you have on here is on this slide. That's one we can spend a whole webinar just on the topic of e-consent and the challenges there, and the role that plays in all of this, to be able to do it dynamically at scale and electronically because of all the addition of these third-party solutions out in the marketplace now. But that's part of the problem is just getting access to the data, and although Mayo is poised well to make that available for customers that they want to, or clients they want to work with. That's not always the case across the industry.
But as you point out with ARPA-H and the notion of an underlying data fabric that will be part of Investor Catalyst or part of the customer experience hub, that kind of thing, you're going to see this more commonplace. I would argue COVID, for the tragedy that it was, has reduced our competitive angst. And that I am seeing throughout the country a completely different notion of collaboration than we saw pre-COVID. So some of those barriers that you've outlined about fear of loss of intellectual property or these sorts of things, they're starting to be a bit diminished. As long as you build a fair playing field, a peer-to-peer playing field with reciprocity, you can bring a lot of partners together.
Thank you. One question that comes across the transom is, the White House's executive order was sort of set in a context, among others, that there needed to be guardrails, and these guardrails, just to the untrained or casual observer, may have raised some serious anxieties about what kind of risks are we facing with AI and with its applications, where we understand that there might be clinical risk. We recognize that there is a lot of things that organizations can do to minimize risk, but it does seem at times people talk about AI as there are risks that we don't know. And can you shed a little light on what was some of, or at least from your vantage point, Steph, and I'll start with you, what were some of the kind of real anxieties that the people who came to speak with the president to help inform that executive order brought to the table?
Well, I could probably, again, this is a culmination of years worth of work, especially, some of the work that predates this administration, but certainly once President Biden came into office, this was a top priority for the White House Office of Science Technology Policy in expanding the work of the National AI Office and looking at it from a protection and safety standpoint and patients, and not just patients, but citizens' rights when it comes to AI. And then being able to know, what role do they have to have awareness about when an algorithm's involved in a decision or a determination that may impact their life, whether it be housing, whether it be healthcare, no matter what it might be. And so, that work has culminated over years, and we've been collecting data points on, HHS, but then also in other industry areas, Justice Department, et cetera, that have been collecting data points for years now on where there are gaps in oversight and where there are risks to society and to individuals. So this executive order was, the administration's kind of, stake in the ground of saying, we're going to do what we can through executive order to try to provide some of those guardrails in place to deal with some of these challenges. Now, not speaking just to in the development of the EO, but over the years, some of the things we've heard of in the House, in Congress, there's a team that had been evaluating the misuse of race data, right, and not just in clinical decisions support tools, but also in administrative tools and other things like that. And there's significant amount of examples where some of these tools that have been deployed have had extremely inequitable outcomes for different patient populations. And actually, the misuse of race data sometimes, because you think, okay, let's make sure we're evaluating and using race data here to better understand it. Well, in some cases, there are studies that show that actually using the race data increases the inequitable outcomes. And actually, it's you need to test it and try it without race data in it, and you might have a more fair, appropriate one. Again, partially because it further projects the biases and inequities that exist in society today. Right, it's taking that into consideration without evaluating it. So those are some of the examples where I'd be happy. I'll put a link into the chat here where there's actually a report from Congress that lists out a number of areas specifically where clinical decision support tools in a number of different condition disease state areas are shown to have unfair, inequitable outcomes based on the misuse of race data alone. And then also we've been working with AHRQ. They were asked by Congress to produce a report on how to mitigate for the misuse of race and race data, and then also bias in algorithms. And I was part of working with the AHRQ team and a number of other federal agencies for over a year on putting together that report. And then also we'll be releasing a manuscript as well that's in line with a lot of the other work we're doing across federal government. That's kind of a very measured step of some considerations to take in place when developing and building and deploying and managing algorithms in healthcare. So I'll drop some links in there that'll give you some of those specific concrete examples. If you think sepsis, I know if you're thinking of EHRs and the sepsis tool a couple of years ago that kind of ended up with some egg on their face. But there's a lot of other ones, so I'll be sure to drop it into the chat.
Thank you. John, from your perspective.
Right. And so just to give you a case example, the Stones algorithm, which is for the prediction of kidney stones, turns out to use race as an input variable. And the fact that it used race as an input variable when there in fact was really no biological basis for expecting racial differences in production of kidney stones resulted in a horribly biased algorithm that would either overdiagnose or underdiagnose. So you have to be really, really careful in even using that as an input variable. The challenge in putting the executive order together was to balance oversight with innovation, right? So I think all of us know that there's no such thing as risk-free innovation, but you also want to protect patients from harm. And so I think all of us are going to have to, within guardrails and guidelines, try new things, ensure patients are not harmed, and we're going to have some great successes and some great failures. And again, I think that's okay. Especially in the world of generative AI, there's going to need to be a lot of experimentation that is going to result in a lot of learning for us all. We need to share across all our institutions what's working and not. I'll give you a quick example. We, following the executive order, following the assurance and the testing, following all the good guidelines and guardrails, we'll try a new approach to building a foundation model, tokenizing the events in a patient life as opposed to the words in their text of a medical record. Because maybe that next event is a lab test, a diagnosis, a hospitalization. Could you imagine looking at 100 million patients? That for a patient that now comes to see a clinician today, we have in a sense, well, what tests should be ordered, what meds should be tried, what diagnoses should be considered. And that is going to potentially democratize access to specialty care. But again, it's going to require so much oversight. Some of my colleagues are suggesting we build a large language model that simply reads the output of other large language models to assess their consistency and reliability. And then, of course, the question comes, and what provides oversight for that? Oh, a large language model. And before you know it, it's as Stephen Hawking would tell us, turtles all the way down of, oversight of oversight of oversight of oversight. But it's the kind of journey that all of us have got to start at least exploring today.
Thank you both for that. Why don't we move on? I know we have other questions. We will get to those, but we also want to move our agenda forward. We talk about, the regulations that are coming into place. We talk about the guardrails that are being set. John, starting with you, are there regulations, constraints that we haven't considered that we should be considering with respect to the use of AI? Whether it's in the training data, whether it's in the model design, whether it's in the testing, are there things that you've seen recently that point to a need for more discrete and well-defined regulation than what you may have known, say, a year ago?
Well, let me just give you one problem. And that is, as we look at a lot of the training sets, there's scarcity of data in social determinants of health. And so if you don't have social determinants of health data, probably the algorithm you produce is not going to appropriately take into account the socioeconomic stresses or lifestyle of the patient. What Mayo did was we created something called the Houses Index, where we mapped every latitude and longitude of every house in the United States, every grocery store, primary care office, Superfund site, crime, education, unemployment. And so you can infer about 40 different variables and then potentially create models that are more fair. So I think all of us are working hard to ensure that every model has transparency, consistency, and reliability. As you heard from Stefan, fairness, appropriateness, validity, equity, and safety. But there's still so much to be learned because the data that we all use, it's incomplete and biased as a very nature. So we'll have to try some techniques and hope that we can improve the quality of the data all of us have collected for decades.
I'm the one who's on mute. There we go. Stefan, from your perspective. Thank you. You're on mute now as well. There we go. We're trading mutes.
Apologies. So I got to be careful on what I say here, because we were actually in the middle of proposed regulation. And so, there's what we can say officially and what we can't. But, in general, what we've proposed in HTI 1 is one effort where we think we do have the ability to help contribute to the, transparency and accountability of the use of algorithms, at least as they're being either built by or delivered through certified health IT vendors, right? And again, it's not necessarily controlling how they're being developed, how they're being deployed, but rather just asking for some transparency and asking for some questions to be attested to that help make it easier for the marketplace to decide if those are good tools to be used or not, to kind of to provide a fabric for equal evaluation of these types of tools. The other thing that it does was also, we put forth as of the Cures Act, our U.S. core data for interoperability. So getting to John's point around SDOH data availability, going from version 1 of USCDI to now where we're, working on version 5. One area that has expanded greatly with the amount of data elements that are in there are around social determinants of health related data, maternal and behavioral health related data elements. to do things just like this and help support the innovation and use of these types of things into these algorithms. But we also want to be able to know if that data is being used and if it's being used appropriately. So that's part of what we're asking people to attest to is, are they using that data and are they using it appropriately? So again, it's, part of it is, testing to the fact of, are they building, the certified health IT vendor, are they building and deploying an algorithm themselves? Or is there one that's being delivered through their health IT product? And if so, the second category is it leveraging a US CDI, the US Core Data for Interoperability that's required, by ONC. So again, just trying to make it easier to both encourage people to use that data, to be aware of it, but then also at the same time make sure that we're evaluating and knowing that it's being used effectively and efficiently and appropriately, and or it's not being used, and to know that, right? To know that they have not trained it on those data elements, and so sometimes the absence of that is a signal as well that it's they haven't done their due diligence and their homework in building that algorithm.
On the flip side of this question, we have what is being done to stimulate and to foster innovation in the development of artificial intelligence. And John, at the beginning of our discussion, we talked about ARPA-H. Do you want to share some perspectives on what you see as some of the opportunities and innovations that ARPA-H and other programs designed to stimulate the ethical and effective implementation of AI? What kind of things we might expect from that side of the issue?
Sure. So I get 50 pitch decks a week, and we find incredible energy and enthusiasm, but a lack of access to appropriately de-identified curated data, and a lack of access to clinical expertise. And so the hope is that with programs like ARPA-H and the Investor Catalyst, entrepreneurs will be given a concierge service to say, love your energy, love your idea and enthusiasm. Now go work with these folks on data and clinical expertise, and then you'll see products and services that will have true value to the marketplace. It's so important that we provide clinical oversight to some of these algorithms. Example, I had an engineer, this was a few months ago, say, wow, I'm going to go develop a model on this wonderful data that is now available. And oh, I did, and it's got an AUC of 0.99. It's amazing. I said, well, what is it? I said, well, if you give high dose morphine to your inpatients, you substantially reduce readmission rates. Well, true. Right. So that's where ARPA-H, it is going to ensure that all of us work together, data, clinical use cases, appropriate business processes.
Stefan, from your perspective, what can we do to, either through government, private industry initiatives, where do you see beyond opposing regulation efforts that will stimulate the US's and global effectiveness in the use of AI? What are some of the things that you think are going to come out of this?
Maybe one way that I could state it is, something else that ONC, manages on behalf of the U.S. government that not a lot of people realize. But we do manage a lot of our global health IT engagements, and actually manage something that we're currently serving as the head of and setting the agenda for, is the Global Digital Health Partnership, or GDHP. This is something that we helped launch a few years ago. It is considered like a master MOU between countries. And one of the topics that we've worked on now for a number of years is AI, and looking at what other countries are doing to try to provide both some of those guardrails, as well as how do they continue to support the adoption and innovation in it. So we produced a report through that effort with the UK and Canada Infoway, which has a great toolkit, by the way, that I suggest people look at, Canada Infoway, on how to deploy and use AI responsibly in healthcare. But we worked together on putting a white paper out and comparing some of these best practices across different global markets and health and governments, and we're continuing that work through the Global Digital Health Partnership. The gdhp.health is the website if you're interested in learning more about that and in finding some of these prior reports. They also look at cybersecurity and a number of other areas that are top of mind for every country when it comes to this. And just to give you the size of the scale of this effort, it's now grown to somewhere around 34 to 36 countries that are part of this GDHP initiative. So it really is a great forum for comparing notes and best practices, because ultimately too, we're going to have solutions that are built in Europe that are being deployed in the US. We're going to have solutions that are built in the US that are looking to be deployed in other markets as well. And we need to make sure that the way that they build those tools and deploy them, that they're doing them in a consistent way that, again, promotes trustworthiness and accountability across all these markets, no matter where they're being deployed in, right? We want that global level best practice. If you look at clinical trials, right, they're being done on a scale globally, right? It's not just in the US, right? So we need to make sure that we're for pandemic preparedness, right, we're learning from clinical trials that are happening in other countries and markets where disease often persist first prior to even coming to the shores of the US, right? And we need to make sure that data can be trusted and valid with us just as much as the same thing, the use of algorithms. So again, I think that there's a lot of work that we can do collaboratively on the U.S. federal side. I'm excited I can tell you there's a lot of work underway that you don't get to see between the different agencies that are working on this tirelessly, really looking at how do we make sure we put a comprehensive web of protection in place, but then still leave the lid off to support innovation. And I can tell you, as you saw in the executive order, it's certainly top of mind for this administration. And I'm fortunate to be working at an agency that gets to collaborate with all these other agencies, and under the leadership of Mickey and Steve Posnack and the great team that we have. Catherine Marchesini, our Chief Privacy Officer, has really been engaged in all these industry-led initiatives like Collaborative for Health AI, CHAI, which we should probably put the link for these in the chat as well, or the Health AI Partnership, or Valid AI, which is a little bit newer, was I think a little more focused on generative AI. But these are great forums. In general, ONC, we only look to regulate and encourage regulations as the last resort, right? Really, we prefer that there's some consensus-based approaches where the industry can kind of lead the way. But we can't always just leave it up to that, right? You can't, have self-monitoring, self-regulating in every situation. And we've seen that as a result of some of these reports that we just shared with you, where unfortunately the guardrails weren't in place, and it's having real-world impacts on patients and on citizens. So we are certainly looking at, how do we not stifle innovation, but we know we do have to provide a role for, putting the right governance and protections in place, because, if not us, then who else is going to do it,
Right. Well, John Halamka, Stefan Konya, I want to thank you for joining us. John, I know you're currently living in another time zone as we speak, having traveled from Scandinavia. Bill, any parting words from you or David Carusio before we thank our speakers and give them the opportunity to either stay or join us, stay or leave? That's your call. We're going to be here from MHDC answering any questions or continuing the dialogue with those of you who want to join us. Bill, any words from you?
Wow, this was great, guys. Thank you. John, great to have you back with us at MHDC. Good to see you. Stephen, thank you. Again, as the slide shows, watch out for next month. We're going to close out the year on the 12th with Stephen's boss, Mickey, and Alexandra from Owens, or from CMS. So thank you, guys. Great session. Appreciate it.
Thank you. All right, we're going to move on to a broader discussion among our group. Why don't we open our screen so we can see all the folks who've joined us. And
Denny, I apologize.
John, go ahead.
I have to go to another meeting, but I just want to say how wonderful it was to see all of my friends, my colleagues. I feel like I am 25 again. So stay in touch. I'm very easy to find, halamka.john@mayo.edu.
Take care, John.
Thank you.
Thank you,
John. Thank you, Stefan.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to open it up. Stefan, are you able to stay with us, or are you going to be having to move on? I know you're busy and we don't want to impose on you.
I apologize. I am actually in Tampa at the Future Cancer Care Summit. We just launched the Cancer X Startup Accelerator Program and some initiatives. And I have to get back to that, but I do apologize. But thank you for having me. The last link I dropped in the chat is actually a blog series that we have on AI that I'd hope you share with all your members, and you can follow along as new things come out. That helps you think of it, just in more plain language about how ONC is thinking about this, and our team that's leading that work with Catherine Marchesini, Jeff and Jordan Everson, and Jeff Smith. are really doing a great job of making it very easy for people to understand and follow along on sending some signals of how we're thinking about this and the things we're trying to do. So highly encourage you to go back and check out that blog series.
Terrific. We will do that. And thank you again for your joining us today and sharing your insights with us today. We look forward to following what you're doing closely in the coming months and hopefully years. Take care.
Sounds good. Thank you, everyone.
Take care.
All right, we're going to open it up for questions and ongoing discussions. I know there are some additional questions that Janice, you had from folks in the audience, and we can bring those up if you would like to share those with us and continue an open dialogue. And folks, you're welcome to take your mics off mute and raise your hands, and we can continue to have an open discussion here.
Yeah, thanks, Denny. I'm going to start with a question that I was hoping we'd get to during the session, but unfortunately we didn't. It'd be great to discuss the current state of play for using commercially available AI APIs, such as those provided by OpenAI, Microsoft Azure, Anthropic, and others in the context of healthcare, including business associate agreements, 42 CFR Part 2, etc. So I'm gonna, since unfortunately Stefan and John were not able to stay, I'm gonna throw this out to the group. Is anyone using any of this technology, and what has your experience been like? Anyone want to chime in on that?
And please speak up if you have any insights or any questions you'd like to add to that. Are folks on the provider side looking at some commercial models? Are folks on the health plan side looking at commercial models? Are you looking to build your own? What are some of the things that you see in your experience or that you've seen elsewhere? Janice, any thoughts from you about that?
I want to comment. I can comment on an experiment that Josh Mandel from Boston Children's and also SMART talked about at Fire Dev Days this year that I thought was very interesting. And he tried to use generative AI to create fire resources out of unstructured data. And what he found, not surprisingly, was that it was pretty dreadful at it at the start. It would create things that looked like fire resources but contained gobbledygook. And what they found, though, that was interesting, is that the initial, if they went through and did the manual work of doing a lot of the cleanup and then retraining the data several rounds, they were able to get the system to generate reasonable fire resources. They weren't perfect, there still needs to be work, but there was definite progress made. But it wasn't as simple as just letting the generative AI loose on the data. It really required multiple rounds of human intervention in between training rounds, people there to really very carefully look at the results they got, fix them, and then basically throw out all the old data and train from scratch on the new stuff. And so I think that one thing that I would say, and this kind of bears with some of what we've seen, if you're using the public data, you have to be really careful. But you can get some good results if you're training, if you use these versions of the products that only look at your data, but then carefully intervene and are willing to put in the time to do multiple rounds. And from my perspective, I think that's where you're going to get, at least initially, a good balance of not being too risky, not being of getting some good results that are useful. And the relying on the public data at this point is not reliable enough. Yeah, maybe it will be at some point in the future. So
Thank you for that, Janice. That's helpful. Folks, you know, in December, we have Mickey Tripathi and Alex Muggy. You know that we're in the midst of a regulatory storm as we speak. Not all of this will be in artificial intelligence, obviously, but many things will affect the data that are going to be used. There was reference to the US Core Data for Interoperability, or the US CDI. There was reference to the use of fire resources and the plan and the expected regulation on interoperability and prior authorization automation is due to be coming out soon. Do you folks in the audience who've joined us today have any of your own perspectives on where you see these kinds of technologies changing your work, or changing the way in which you deal with customers, the way in which you deal with others in your business? Any thoughts you'd like to share with us?
I think this is Vijay. I think without having a trust between the payers and providers, all of these initiatives are not going to be fully kind of, implemented. That's my understanding. And the other thing is, if we don't have a proper network where standards are exchanged correctly, again, there'll be issues. So those are two big things I see: trust and a network that can allow good exchanges of correct data and so on.
I think that's such a great
Thank you,
point,
Vijay.
BJ.
Yeah.
Having, just for almost anything in this world, having clean, clear, well-defined, standardized data that can be exchanged and used by many different people is just really essential. But AI is an area where it's particularly important because you need that in order to train things properly. Denny, if I may continue asking questions that came in from the audience.
Sure.
What advice would you give health? So this came from John Beasley. I don't know if John is still on the call. What advice would you give healthcare execs regarding how to develop the business model for AI solutions when they need to justify it from a financial standpoint and have a positive revenue model? I don't know if anyone has been through that process yet and has any thoughts on that.
I would say, and this is a very good question, and I saw it come across the transom during our conversation. A business model is essential. You have to have a business case for the implementation of any technology, and it needs to be a financial case in almost all businesses. In the absence of a financial return on investment, projects of any type just simply don't get implemented. But one of the things that I think is intriguing about this question, and also with respect to what Vijay said, is, innovation moves at the speed of trust. I saw some expression like that during the WEDI conference that I attended earlier this week. And that trust, I think, has to be part of any business case. If you're looking at how do you go from where you are today to the implementation of a technology, an AI technology in this case, looking at the implementation as purely a technological project is short-sighted. There needs to be active engagement across all the constituents, all the representatives in the organization and your partners. And there has to be an underlying trust that the sources and uses of data, whether it's to drive an AI algorithm or to support the exchange and development of quality measures or prior authorization automation, they have to be rooted in the trusted commitment of both parties or multiple parties to see that initiative through. Otherwise, the business case will, however exciting it is on paper, will fail to materialize. And I think that's an important perspective we bring as a consortium, working with the members of our consortium on a number of things. Is, do we have a level of trust? Have we established a level of trust? And are we able to bring together stakeholders who may not enter the conversation with that much trust? So I think that's a key part of it. I don't know if anyone else has other thoughts or comments they want to add to building a business case for AI in your organization. Any thoughts?
Anyone from the audience want to speak before I address this?
No, Janice, why don't you go ahead?
All right.
Ferris Taylor has raised his hand. Hold on
Ferris,
one
why
second.
don't you
Ferris,
go ahead?
Go ahead.
My mind is on information overload with respect to this week's discussions. The sessions with WEDI were a lot focused on AI as well. And as all of you know, my information is secondhand because I'm not in a line position in healthcare right now. But as I talk in particular with healthcare executives, the confidence level or the trust level is pretty low. And it isn't just the business model and the ROI, Denny, that you've mentioned and that VJ raised with respect to the trust, but there's a fear right now from both a political and a legal point of view, or at least a fear of anything that they do is going to be scrutinized, and the cost, the brand damage that takes place is greater than the ROI at this point. And I don't know how as a society we get over this, but everybody's kind of frozen in their tracks because they're afraid of getting sued or getting publicity. I flash back to almost 30 years ago, maybe it was 30 years ago, when I was at Harvard Community there in Boston. Harvard Community got lambasted because who was the CIO at the time, was trying to do more electronic medical records. And there was a professor in a university that went ballistic that their psychiatrist notes were going to be out on the internet. And almost every day there was a newspaper article on the problems with electronic data and privacy and all of that. And that whole article, or that whole series of articles, stopped when an editor at the Boston Globe was at one of the cancer institutes there and accidentally got an overdose of chemo, 4 times the dose, and died. And immediately the conversation was, oh, we need more sharing of data. So it's both the public concern around AI and how we use it, as well as the business issue that comes up. And I don't know if that adds to the conversation or not, but my head's spinning right now, Denny, and appreciate you guys taking on the topics as you do.
Well, thank you, Ferris. I think our heads are all spinning with the news that has been raining on us with respect to AI and these technologies. And it doesn't help that we have certain spokespersons who forecast the end of the world as we know it because of the implementation of these technologies. But I think what you've highlighted, in addition to trust, is a real understanding of not just the risk of failure, but the cost of failure, which can be enormous. The risks, one can mitigate risks to a reasonable degree, to a reasonable degree. But if even the small risk happens and the cost of that risk, the cost of failure associated with is so high, many organizations, especially in an industry as conservative as healthcare, are going to be looking at these technologies from some distance before they get very close to them and wanting to see who else is implementing what they're thinking about and whether or not they're succeeding at it or failing at it. And I think there are more stories to come. But Janice, you had a question that you wanted to throw into this sort of perspective.
Yeah, what I actually think, there's a question that's related to the comment I was going to make. So I'm going to ask that audience question, and then I'll start with my answer, which sort of follows on to the previous question and to this question. So Claire Cruz from Nehigh asks, have you considered what kind of training clinicians will need in the future to appropriately, safely, and optimally adopt AI tools? And let me just go back to the previous question, because I actually think that one of the biggest problems with AI adoption is that so many people don't understand what AI is or what it gives you. And I think even in the return on investment and making your case for your AI, there needs to be a really big education component. People don't understand that when you spit back a list of people who meet some qualifications, that's not 100% definitive yes, no answer. This is a probabilistic system. And some people are making a decision as to what criteria you need to meet to get that yes. In most machine learning systems, that's called a threshold. And having that education and making that part of all of this process is really important. And that's something that I don't see happening nearly enough. A lot of the discussion around AI is that it's giving you the answers to life, the universe, and everything else, and it's not spitting out 42. Sorry for the joke. But it's really needs to be looked at as a tool that people can use and as a tool that they need to understand. And for each time they use AI, there needs to be a clear understanding of what exactly it is that you're getting out of it. And from whether it's at the board level or the decision maker level in deciding whether you're going to do an AI program, or it's at the clinician level and understanding how to use it, or the patient level in understanding the conversation you're having with your clinician and making your own decisions about whether you want to go with the recommendation. There's just so many different constituencies that need that education if this is going to be something that gets adopted from a clinical perspective. And I think I even touched on one other question that was asked too, so that's good. I don't know if anyone else wants to comment further on the training, education, that type of elements of AI.
Well, Dave Delano has his hand raised. Dave, do you want to share your perspective or what questions you have?
I do. Yeah, I do. I also want to compare notes with Ferris because I was at Harvard Community back in those days as well, and remember that whole EHR conversation. It was Judy Klickstein that was the CIO at the time, and I worked on the AMRS system there. And this notion of clinical algorithms using data is not a new concept. It's just that AI is being applied to so many things now that it's become a generic term. Like everybody just says, well, what about AI? What about AI? Well, the term AI is very broad. And I think when we start talking about ROI and return on investment and adoption and training, to Janice's point, and clinical outcomes and physicians and how they're going to adapt to this, there are applications of AI all over the world in all kinds of applications today. When you call in and you get a bot on your phone that says, tell me what you're calling about, that's artificial intelligence. That's voice recognition.
We all know how badly those work.
And they work terribly. And so the thing is that AI applied in healthcare can be applied to administrative purposes, to operational use cases like John was describing, to the far-reaching diagnostic, probabilistic, huge data set work that the Mayo Clinic is doing, all the way down to answering phone calls on the call center and routing those to the correct people. So the use case is really the focal point. And what we did back in the day with Harvard Community Health Plan is we wrote this program called Health Screen Print that would go through the electronic health record at the time, which was the CoStar ambulatory EHR based on the CoStar system. And we would identify patients as they were coming in for scheduled appointments and say, this patient looks like they're due for their, whatever it may be, their periodic health exam, their mammogram, their eye exam because they're diabetic and they haven't had it in the past 6 months. And we would present that to the clinician. The clinician would then say, yeah, but the reason that they haven't had that is because they've been in chemo. And we don't want to have all, sort of false results as a result of a particular test, while somebody's undergoing chemo treatment. So there's a reason why they haven't had those other things done. So it was always just suggestive to the clinicians. It was not intended to forcibly say this person, must do this, or that. So, that was a very early, type of, it was algorithmic. I wouldn't call it AI in the sense of the way it's determined today on huge data sets with much more advanced, algorithms. But it was essentially looking through the patient's history and suggesting things that may be appropriate for care or treatment. So these are not new concepts, but the use of it and the generic terminology of the way the term AI is used so broadly really has to be focused on what is the use case we're talking about, what's the business case for that, what are the risks associated with it, and how does it apply to a particular scenario, and is it effective for that particular use? So I think that's kind of how I think of it. And Ferris, we should compare notes sometime. Thanks.
That's great.
Yeah,
one
I
of the
think
other
that's true.
challenges.
Sorry,
Janice,
go ahead, Denny.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say one of the other challenges, and this is something that is near and dear to the Health Data Consortium's heart, which is the quality of data. And as John alluded to this in his discussion, that we have, historically, clinical data has been in notes, whether SOAP notes or visit summaries or particular text entries that physicians have traditionally and other clinicians have traditionally written on paper. And the challenge we face as we move into a more interoperable health data economy is that a lot of the data are not interoperable as they currently stand. And this is really magnified when we see efforts to drive artificial intelligence algorithms when the data themselves lack the completeness, the quality, the accuracy that is necessary to drive a model. Many people believed when we implemented ICD-10 that we would have a much more robust diagnostic infrastructure with respect to data that we would be able to use. But the reality is ICD-10 is a billing coding system, and many clinicians don't enter a specific ICD-10 code for a specific patient condition or procedure. They go with what they're most familiar with, and then coders subsequently make those changes. So there are a lot of ways in which the chain of data development and data deployment needs to be looked at too before those data are put into a predictive model of any type. So something else to think of. Janice,